You know, we always talk about players who are overpaid, players who signed a ridiculously large contract and never lived up to it. That happens all the time. But very rarely do we ever talk about players, sometimes superstars, who signed an extremely underwhelming contract, despite being worth way more than what they signed. Now, it's easy to look back in hindsight and say it was a good deal for them back then considering the circumstances, but even so, that doesn't mean they couldn't have pushed for something better. How's it going, folks? My name's Andy, and in this video, we're gonna take a look at contracts that should not have been signed. These contracts incredibly undervalued their worth. Some even led to controversy, with the players trying to terminate and renegotiate. Anyway, let's get started. But before we start, this video is sponsored by Halftime Hoops. What is it? It's an amazing online hub for basketball fans where you can create live audio rooms, chat with fans and experts of the game, and find scores, highlights, and all the latest news. My favorite part is that anyone could host their own audio room, wait for others to join, and talk to each other about basketball. You can engage in live conversations with other passionate fans. You can also follow your favorite players and teams and keep up with their latest highlights, news, and box scores. Every time someone posts something new about your favorite players, you'll see it pop up in your feed. The app is very user-friendly, and everything is laid out nicely for you to navigate through different pages. To download it, go to the App Store and search for Halftime Hoops for Android and iOS. It's completely free, and you can follow me by looking for Andy Hoops on the search bar. Follow the link in the description or download it from the App Store. Anyway, let's get started. Lou Williams. In 2018, Lou Williams signed an extension to stay with the Clippers for 3 years, $24 million. That was incredibly low. It was arguably the best bargain in the entire league. Lou was having a career season, being a near all-star caliber player and leading the charge in a surprising season for the Clips. This was before Kawhi and Paul George came around. Lou was that guy. But signing this extension that earned him just $8 million a year for his production, that's too little. Pretty much all reports said he would have gotten a lot higher offers if he allowed himself to enter free agency. But Lou's main desire was to stay in LA. He loved living there, he liked the atmosphere, and had a lot of friends in the area. Most players value money first and foremost, so they're content with moving to another city for a bigger payday. But for Lou, he valued and cherished his time living in LA. That's why he signed a lowball offer to stay. It's not like he was chasing a championship either, because remember, he signed this deal before Kawhi and George came. He wanted to stay there. Unfortunately, the Clippers didn't feel the same way. His role slowly changed, and the new additions slashed into his minutes and touches, but that didn't bother him. He didn't mind that, but getting traded away did bother him. His selfless sacrifice was in vain, and the culture he created in LA, that hard-nosed work ethic he established there, and yet they didn't feel like they needed him. To which he responded, "It hurts. Just to be candid, it hurts." Lou wanted to stay in LA for the rest of his career, and he made that very clear to the organization. That's why he took a pay cut. And situations like this are the reason why players should always aim for the most money possible. Isaiah Thomas. So prior to joining the Celtics, Isaiah Thomas was still a very good player. Everyone knows he blew up in Boston, but before that, in Sacramento, he was already making waves as a very good point guard. Of course, his height was still a major concern, and that's why his offers were kinda meh. In the 2014 offseason, right after a season where Thomas averaged 20 and 6, he expected the offers to pour onto the table. But he really didn't get that many good ones, most of which were shorter 2-year deals. Isaiah was not looking for a short 1 or 2-year deal. He wanted stability, he wanted more years. So he accepted a 4-year, $27 million contract with the Phoenix Suns. Now, I don't blame him for accepting this. That's a lot of money for the 60th pick of the draft. He needed that money. But because this deal was 4 years, that's a really long time in the NBA world. Things changed fast, and during that span, Thomas became a legit superstar. But also in that same span, he suffered a hip injury that changed his career forever. Not only did he lose out on so much money due to terrible timing, but if he had signed a shorter deal, this wouldn't have happened. He was clearly already outperforming his contract in the first few years of it, and if it ended sooner, he could have re-signed a much larger one. Hindsight is 2020. Nobody knew he'd become such a fantastic player in a very short time. Still, 4 years, $27 million, even at the time of signing? After having a great season, that's very low. Especially compared to someone like, for example, Brandon Knight. Knight got 3 years, $40 million after a season of averaging worse numbers than Isaiah, but his contract was so much better. John Starks. Going back in history, the New York Knicks of the 1990s were a super competitive team. Those teams were filled with notable players, including John Starks, one of the most popular Knicks of all time. However, Starks was also atrociously underpaid for most of his career. He wasn't a superstar by any stretch, but he was an all-star, and always a valuable contributor on the team, routinely being the second leading scorer, behind Patrick Ewing. In 1992, he accepted the Knicks' extension offer of 4 years, $4.8 million. I know it's the 90s and salaries were much lower back then, but even by those standards, this is still a drastic underpay for a guy who would eventually become an all-star. That would happen in 1994, where Starks averaged 19 points per game, and yet, according to Hoops Hype salaries, he was ranked as the 189th highest paid player in the league. Like half the league made more money than him. He was the second leading scorer on a team that reached the NBA Finals, but that's all the money he's making? This was a popular point of discussion back in the 90s. It was common for players to sign long-term deals with no chance of renegotiation. It wasn't until the 2000s where the idea of including opt-out clauses and other player protections in contracts became widespread in the NBA. It wasn't just Starks either in the 90s. You'll see later in this video other prominent players who signed for comically small contracts. Ben Wallace. In the early 2000s, Ben Wallace was just getting started. He was on the rise and already established himself as a premier defensive player. This prompted the Pistons to offer him a 6-year, $34 million deal in the 2000 offseason. It seemed like a solid deal for Ben at the time. Prior to joining the Pistons, he didn't have as much notoriety, and this contract seemed reasonable. Some even argued it was an overpay for Big Ben. It was hard to gauge his value because, he was arguably the best defender in the league, but also one of the worst offensive players. How do you determine his worth? However, right when he joined the Pistons, it was clear that Wallace was worth way more, just from his sheer defensive presence alone. In that 6-year time span of his contract, Wallace won 4 Defensive Player of the Years, nominated to 6 All-Defensive teams, 5 All-NBA teams, and anchored a team that reached at least the conference finals for all 6 years of his contract. That included a championship in 2004, and another finals appearance in 2005. Yet during this entire time, in most years, he was outside of the top 100 paid players in the league. He was making a fraction of what other superstars were making. You had guys like Tom Gugliotta, Brian Grant, and Chris Dudley making more money than Wallace. That's how absurd it was. Of course, with all these contracts, I'm looking back in hindsight. At the time of the signing, few analysts thought Wallace would improve the way he did. But the signs were there. His game wasn't all that different before joining the Pistons. It's just now he got the spotlight and opportunity to really show it. Also, Ben got a lot of flack for leaving the Pistons to join the Bulls in 2006. But, the Bulls offered him a lot of money. And considering Ben has been underpaid for his entire career, he certainly deserved it. Scottie Pippen. In 1991, Scottie Pippen signed an extension worth 5 years, $18 million. That extension would begin in the 1993-94 season and end in 1998. By the final season of his contract, 1998, the Bulls' final championship, Scottie Pippen was the 6th highest paid player on his own team. Yikes. The thing is, this is more of a result of how fast the league increased in popularity during this span. which led to rapid increases in the salary cap. Initially, when Pippen signed the deal, it was okay. He was a top 10 paid player in the league in 1993, but by 1998, he was outside of the top 100. In an article by Sam Quinn of CBS Sports, this is how he described it. In Chicago's final championship season, Pippen was the 6th highest paid Bull and the 122nd highest paid NBA player. Owner Jerry Reinsdorf and general manager Jerry Krause refused to negotiate the deal, instead taking advantage of his minuscule cap number to put championship rosters around Pippen and Jordan. Pippen's frustrations colored his entire tenure with the team through his eventual departure in a 1999 sign-and-trade with the Houston Rockets. At the peak of the tension, Scottie sometimes wanted to quit. He sometimes did not even want to play and sit out instead. Back then, there weren't any regulations to protect players from signing an undervalued contract. Nowadays, a lot of contracts scale with the salary cap, but back then, there weren't any clauses like that. And of course, players did not have the power to renegotiate a deal. Pippen was just stuck with being underpaid. Of course, it was his decision to sign it though. He wanted the stability of securing the money. Looking back, Pippen said he does not regret his decision, because you can never predict the NBA blowing up in popularity like it did. Michael Jordan. Similar to Scottie, Jordan also signed a contract that was initially pretty good, but eventually made him severely underpaid as the years progressed. Except for Jordan, it was an 8-year contract, for $25 million total. From 1988 to 1996, he was making $3 million per year. Obviously, his value was way more than that. There's no way to measure how much MJ was worth to the franchise, probably over $100 million a year to be frank. It was honestly hilarious how little he was making. The best player in the league, the best player in history at the peak of his career, was the 32nd highest paid player in the NBA. In the 1995-96 season, he made less money than Sean Bradley. Jordan admitted he probably should have signed smaller deals and not lock himself for that long, but it was kind of the standard in the league at the time. Players didn't have much room to go against that, and Jerry Reinsdorf was stubborn and would not budge. It was a blessing for the organization if a star player got stuck with an undervalued contract. These contracts were part of the reason why the 1999 NBA lockout happened, also because of Kevin Garnett, but that's another story. The league needed new regulations for how contracts should be set up, and basically set actual standards and limitations for what you can and can't offer to a player. At least for Jordan, in his final 2 years in Chicago, he made over $30 million each year, which was literally more than the entire salary cap. Anyway, that's all folks. Those were a few NBA players who should not have signed the contracts they did. Can you think of any others that belong on this list? Which other ones can you think of? Thank you all so much for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed the video, and of course, as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.